when you're someone who can't just easily fit into anywhere, like I have lots of friends who don't have ADHD who hate their jobs. They don't like what they do, but they can do it. And they do well at their jobs. And they just say to me, yeah, I don't like my job, but put in the time. I come home, I chill, I do what I want. I would be miserable. Like it would clinically depress me. There's no way I could go to work. Like I have a passion for what I do because I have to, Eric, as I'm sure you can relate. Like it would really be a significant impact on my mental health if I didn't love, what I was doing. And so when you have ADHD and you feel like there's a narrow bandwidth here of where I feel like I can kind of fit in and be happy, and then you have all these other risk factors that people with ADHD may have, whether it's a comorbid disorder, whether it's family dysfunction, whether it's you can see how all those things can stack up.
ADHD Rewired, episode 307. This is the podcast for those of us with really good intentions and a slightly wandering attention. I'm Eric Tivers. I'm a licensed clinical social worker by training and a coach by design. I'm your host and I have ADHD. ADHD Rewired is more than just a podcast. We are a community. We are wired for connection and you are not alone. Go to ADHDrewired.com to learn how you can join us in our free secret Facebook group. Get additional resources for every episode, including links to any resources we mention on today's show. You can support us on Patreon, sign up for our email newsletter. You can request podcast postcards to distribute to your clients and support groups, and you can learn all about our intensive online video-based coaching and accountability groups. You can do all of this at our website, ADHDrewired.com. We know that starting is the hardest part, so let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of ADHD Rewired. Today we have returning to the podcast for, the umpteenth time, Dr. Roberto Olivardia. Dr. Olivardia is a clinical psychologist and lecturer at the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He maintains a private practice in Lexington, Massachusetts, where he specializes in the treatment of ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, body dysmorphic disorder, and males with eating disorders. He currently serves on the professional advisory boards for CHAD and ADHD and the National Association for Males with Eating Disorders. He's also on the scientific advisory board for Adhd, as well as a featured expert on understood.org. He is an active member of Decoding Dyslexia Massachusetts and is a raving music fan, and we'll talk to you about that all day long. Roberto, it is good to have you back here on the podcast.
It's always a pleasure, Eric.
So how did you get into this topic of ADHD and suicidality?
Sure. So first, just to let your listeners know, some of whom may be struggling with suicidal thoughts themselves, that there is a National Suicide Prevention Hotline, and that number is 1-800-273-8255 or 1-800-273-TALK. And if you call that, you will talk to a professionally trained person that can help you. So for people who are coming to this conversation because maybe they're looking for help and they're looking for resources, that number is available 24 hours a day. It's a national hotline. And
is that only for people in the U.S.?
I believe it's for the U.S. Yes. Okay. And perhaps people in other countries, there may be hotlines like that, but I would imagine if people from outside call that number, they may at least be getting some support. I don't know if I can't speak to whether they can direct them to resources in their country, specifically. So I guess part of it is just so we understand the gravity of this situation is understanding from numbers, that in 2017 alone, about 47,000 people took their lives. And in that, when you break it down, it's about 129 people a day are killing themselves. And in the course of this conversation, 6 people in this country will die by suicide. And for the first time, actually, the CDC earlier last year said that our life expectancy something we hadn't seen in decades. Our life expectancy actually was decreasing from the year prior. And the two main reasons for that were drug overdoses and suicides. And so this has become a real problem. And that's with suicides. And we also know that there have been 1,400,000 suicide attempts that have also occurred within that year time. It's a second leading cause of death for people between the ages of 15 to 34. And something that we're seeing in younger people. I've worked with kids as young as 12 who have attempted suicide, who have had serious suicidal ideation. It's affecting older adults as well. It does not discriminate with age, socioeconomic status, financial status, marital status, that this is something that we just want to pay attention to. And one of the things that had me want to talk about this at the last conference, had me want to talk about this with you and your listeners and community, is that in the ADHD world, I am always interested in the sort of comorbidities, sort of the associated disorders or issues that we see with ADHD, and how we understand when somebody has ADHD and, let's say, depression. How does it impact the ADHD and depression when people have both? How does it impact the treatment? How do we make sure that both of these conditions are properly being treated? And as you know, unfortunately, there's still lots of ignorance around ADHD, where people often will dismiss it as just an issue of focus, just an academic issue. And I hear this not from even lay people, but from people in our community, in the mental health community, where I will be part of treatment teams or whatnot, where somebody might have a complexity of diagnoses, one of which is ADHD. And I've heard, well, they're not in school anymore, so the ADHD doesn't really matter, and it sort of gets bumped off as something to consider. And I'm thinking sometimes, actually, the ADHD is the main thing here that's driving the bus. Now, it's not always, but often it's going to be a main contributor to the overall issue. And with suicide, there is a research literature looking at this, and I just felt it was time to talk about that and understand how the studies do consistently show that having ADHD elevates one's risk for self-harm, for suicidal ideation, and for suicide.
And does that include even people who may not have a history of depression?
Yes. So we know that studies that have looked at the additive risk, so when people do have depression, do have bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, substance abuse, eating disorders, which all carry high suicide rates, that when you have ADHD, it statistically significantly elevates the risk of suicide. So if I'm working with someone with bipolar disorder, let's say, in which studies show that anywhere from 40 to 50% of people with bipolar disorder attempt suicide. It's a very high suicide attempt rate. If I'm working with someone with bipolar disorder and ADHD, I'm very, very watchful and monitoring that much more so, because having ADHD increases that even more. So we know that it can have an additive risk, which already makes it very clinically important to always acknowledge and treat the ADHD. However, what is interesting is that even when someone just has ADHD, in absence of any mental health condition, even controlling for poverty, controlling for substance abuse, that having ADHD can elevate your risk of suicide. And, there are studies, Stephen Hinshaw did a great, his studies are so methodologically strong, and he did a great study of girls between the ages of 6 and 12, followed them up over 10 years, and compared the girls with ADHD versus the girls without ADHD. And he found that the girls with ADHD, that 30% of them had a suicide attempt in that 10-year period versus only 6% of controls. Of those girls, 80% of the girls with ADHD engaged in self-harm behavior versus only 19% of the controls. So that's a robust finding, very robust finding. There are studies that have looked at also in all different parts of the world that have found significantly different rates. There was a study, Andrea Cronus Toscano did a study of 14-year actually follow-up, looking at from kids from the ages of 4 to 6, followed them for 14 years, found that over that period, 12% of the ADHD group had a plan for suicide at some point in their lives versus only 1% of controls. So these are, again, significant findings. And there are many others that I could state, but this is something we have to really pay attention to and begin to understand why are we seeing this.
You in one of your the stats, you looked at the elevated rate of self-harm and
yes,
and suicidal attempts or thoughts. Can you parse out the differences between self-harm and suicide? Because not someone who is engaging in self-injurious behavior isn't necessarily suicidal.
Yes, I'm glad you asked that. So by self-harm, we're referring to a behavior in which the person may not have an intent to die by suicide, but maybe it could be in the form of cutting, of burning behaviors, where it's creating some level of stimulation for the person. It could come from feelings of emptiness, and sometimes self-harm creates a feeling of aliveness. It can, for people who have histories of trauma, that self-harm is, these are not healthy coping mechanisms, but this is an understanding of why people do this, that they might engage in self-harm to feel alive and to feel kind of in their bodies and very grounded. However, I've worked with people with ADHD who don't have those issues, but say that they got into self-harm merely because it was just stimulating to them as a form of just stimulation. Now, I know that, and this is not, it doesn't, I guess, go in the category of self-harm, but when I was a kid, I have ADHD, and I'd be like virtually narcoleptic in, my classes, that I used to give myself toe cramps to literally wake myself up. Like, you can, if you bend your toe, your big toe one way and your other toe the other, it like cramps. And I don't know if you've ever had a toe cramp. Like, it can be painful. But if I was like in the verge of falling asleep, I would give myself a toe cramp, and it wasn't experienced as pain. It was actually experienced as like, it would like almost wake me up. It would like jolt me awake. And so I've heard stories from people with ADHD. I remember this woman I worked with some years ago who she used to really pinch the inside of her thigh when she was in school as a way of maintaining focus, but to the point that she would puncture her skin and it would start to bleed, and then she'd pick at it. And she said it wasn't out of depression. It wasn't out of dissociation. It just came. And then she said it sort of worked, where she was more focused and more, but what she was doing was self-medicating dopamine, because we get a rush of endorphins and dopamine with pain. So it can come from that, as well. So even though the person's intent in all of these cases, whether it's trauma related, depression related, stimulating related, might not be to die, what studies have shown, however, is one of a significant risk factor in suicide is what Thomas Joyner, who's one of the leading suicidologists in this country. He wrote a wonderful book called Why People Die by Suicide. I would highly recommend it. And he talks about 3 main risk factors in his research, in his suicide research lab. One was what he called an acquired ability to enact lethal self-injury. So in other words, we are biologically programmed to not kill ourselves. Like, our body does whatever it can to survive. And that we see that with eating disorders. We see that with substance abuse, that our bodies are really resilient to try to keep ourselves alive in that way. So in order to almost override that system, what his theory is that a lot of people who do die by suicide have almost kind of developed this habituation to pain, and a habituation also to the fear of pain, because a lot of times what prevents people from taking their lives is they're fearful of the pain that it could, bring them. And that's human nature. I mean, in some ways we should be fearful of that. But what he has found is that one of the reasons we see elevated risks of suicide with, let's say, people with eating disorders, people who are sleep deprived, substance abusers, people who have abuse histories, is that there's a habituation, a sort of experience with pain that people are unfortunately getting used to. And if you self-harm, you are 100 times more likely to die by suicide than someone who does not self-harm. So even though the intent may not be to die, the repeated experiences of self-harm coupled with other factors can then make you at much higher risk for suicide. So it's still, I mean, obviously a behavior we have to pay attention to. But in addition to that acquired ability, he talked about a perceived sense of burdensomeness and what he called a thwarted belongingness. So a feeling that you don't fit in or belong, that those three risk factors he finds are easily put somebody into a elevated risk of suicide.
So I think it would be a fair sort of connection to think that because of the impulsivity component of ADHD and our tendency to get carried away, that there may potentially be more sort of accidental, like the I don't know, is there like a word for the things that's like a non-attempt attempt?
Yeah. So what and I think that where the research is trying to understand more is how impulsive is it really? So in general, I mean, there are a lot of myths about suicide, but one of the myths is that it's impulsive, that actually most suicide attempts that people have in some ways in the moment that it happens might be impulsive, but in the grander picture is something that the person has thought about perhaps for a long time, has maybe mentally rehearsed it, has maybe practiced it. And what I mean by that is might have actually engaged in behaviors to, again, get them used to a certain kind of feeling. And so, but the actual moment that it happens may be somewhat impulsive, meaning that sometimes people plan it out and sometimes people have these strong suicidal urges and thoughts. And then on a particular day, something, the straw that breaks the camel's back then can have somebody do something very dangerous. But you're right. I mean, when we think about ADHD, we think of impulsivity, people who have we have a higher rate of emotional dysregulation. We know that if we look at those three factors alone that Dr. Joyner talks about, a thwarted sense of belongingness. How many people with ADHD feel that they don't belong, that they don't fit in? When you have executive dysfunction and your ADHD is not managed and it's not treated, if it's not even identified or diagnosed, and you feel you're worthless and you feel like you have no place in the world, that's a scary, terrifying feeling. And then if you don't have a social group, if you're socially isolated, we know people with ADHD, and we know half of people with ADHD also have a learning disability, and that puts you even at a higher risk of being bullied, of being ostracized. So unless you find your tribe, it's very easy to start to think, I don't belong here. And then you put that sense of burdensomeness. I've heard kids at 11 say, I'm just too much for my parents. They'd be better off without me. I'm a burden to them. How many adults that we know who have ADHD, who struggle with unemployment, who struggle with money management issues, who feel like burdens? And, what pains me is when people think of this idea of suicide as being a selfish act. It's not selfish at all. That's not at all. In fact, many individuals who attempt, when they tell their stories, they'll say they honestly thought, now either they'll say one of two things I often hear. The majority of people who have attempted, they'll say either they thought what they were doing was actually going to help their family or their children because they felt like such burdens to them that they thought they will get over this. In fact, they're going to be almost relieved that I'm not here, because that's how dark your mindset could get. Or what I often hear from people is that the dark feeling that they feel and the disconnect that they feel almost doesn't even allow them to think about how it's going to impact people. It's almost like imagining if you're on fire, you're not going to think about like what anything else around you or other people or things are happening. You're just looking to extinguish that fire and get yourself safe. And that's how people who struggle with these on a daily basis, feel. So it is not selfish, but we can understand how people with ADHD, just given those 3 risk factors where they don't feel like they belong, they feel like they are a burden. And then if they engage in high risk activities that can basically create, even on an unintentional manner, create this habituation to pain, or for their bodies to sort of take abuse in some ways. And that comes in different forms. I was on your show years ago talking about sleep. I have a history of sleep problems, sleep disorders. There's no question. And I don't drink alcohol, or things like that, but I know that I have abused my body, and I use that word in terms of what I put it through in terms of the sleep deprivation of, particularly when I was younger, all-nighters, 2 all-nighters in a row, and totally looking at sleep as this disposable thing, which is not a good thing because my body should not be used to that. And so when you're working with someone now who has depression and sleep deprivation, because sleep deprivation, my mind got wacky at some of those times, And so if you put in other risk factors, it's not good. So we have to kind of think about, all those people with ADHD who aren't getting sometimes the support that they need, and how it makes sense why they would be feeling that way.
Roberto, I want to take a quick break. Before we do, though, can you give that number to the suicide hotline one more time?
Sure. It's 1-800-273-TALK or 1-800-273-8255.
All right. We will be right back.
I decided to join the group because I was ready to tackle my ADHD and really take it to the next level and how to address it and help it. Some of the things that I learned through this process was that I'm actually really good at planning and thinking ahead. I just don't typically trust that process and trust myself. And so that's been a huge insight for me through this group, and something that I'm going to continue to work on moving forward.
Where are you in your journey with your ADHD? Go ahead and take the next step. Our registration event is only 2 weeks away. Go to coachingrewired.com and click on the big green button to get on the list for an invitation to our spring coaching and accountability groups. Our kickoff registration event will be Tuesday, February 18th at 12 p.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern. The spring sessions start April 8th and go through June 19th. Don't hesitate to sign up today. During the registration event, I will answer your questions about the coaching and accountability groups. Listen as Heron continues with her story.
Before this group, I really didn't understand what it meant to fully accept my ADHD. I thought I was doing pretty good, but most of the time, the structures and planning and the accomplishments that I would focus on, I perceived them as doing that in spite of my ADHD. And that ADHD still remained an obstacle that I had to work around rather than work with. So now I understand it. Eric's words of understanding my strengths and how to use them, understanding my challenges and how to accommodate them, and being okay with what it is that I need to do in order to live the life that I want to live. And that's been very powerful for me.
Live the life that you want to live and go to coachingrewired.com. Click on the big green button so you get invited to our kickoff registration event on February 18th. Registration is by invitation only. Even if you were on our list from our previous seasons, we don't want to send anyone any unwanted emails. You need to go back to coachingrewired.com and click on the big green button. This is a 10-week session that starts April 8th and goes through June 19th. We are meeting Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. If you are looking for an intensive coaching group that will help you plan more effectively by teaching you how to combat time blindness and get exponentially better at managing your time, then join us for our spring sessions. If there's one area of your life, one project, one specific habit you would like to develop this spring, join us and be supported by your peers. with the accountability you need to turn good intentions into amazing actions. Don't miss out. These groups will fill up fast. To get invited to our kickoff registration event on February 18th, go to coachingrewired.com and click the big green button. You will get a save the date email, and invitations will go out in early February. The registration event starts at 12 p.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Central, 3 Eastern. Our spring sessions start April 8th. You can learn more about our coaching groups at our website. Your journey starts at coachingrewired.com. Are you new to the podcast? Welcome. Thanks for listening. And thank you to all of our patrons who help make this podcast possible with your contributions. Consider becoming a patron today. Give a gift that makes sense to you, and we'll give a gift right back with perks. If you find value in these podcasts, become a patron at ADHDrewired.com/Patreon. Check out the perks starting at just $5 a month. In fact, I just uploaded it today, and I'm recording this on January 30th, an interview I just did with Dr. Russell Ramsey on CBT and ADHD, and it was so good that I had to upload the unedited video of it to patrons, and it's available there now for people who give at just $5 a month or more. And remember, you can join me and a small group of other patrons every fourth Tuesday of the month for a group coaching call on Zoom if you support us at a $25 a month or more contribution. Our next call will be on February 25th at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. Don't forget to add it to your calendar. Whatever your reason for giving and whatever amount you are able to give, thank you. It really does help, and it really does mean a lot. Become a patron at ADHDrewired.com/Patreon. That's ADHDrewired.com/Patreon. Patreon is Patreon. And thanks. All right, we are back with Dr. Roberto Olivardia. And there was a story I remember you telling about I think it was a client of yours, or it was a case you consulted on, where this guy had rehearsed this suicide in his mind so many times that he used it as a way of self-soothing.
Yes. So sometimes, what's important too is that when we ask people, because it's a myth that if we ask somebody, are you feeling suicidal? Are you at risk? That it's going to make them suicidal or promote it. It does the opposite, actually. If you are concerned about somebody in your life, it's okay to say, do you have any thoughts of hurting or harming yourself? Because sometimes, or what that often will do for someone, and what we hear from people with the lived experience of this, is it means that clearly it can't be that crazy and that unique to have these kinds of thoughts. If you're asking them about it, it means, oh, I guess other people must have these kinds of thoughts, and you're destigmatizing it for them. Because the problem is suicide, there's such a stigma around even having these kinds of thoughts. Now, many people have suicidal thoughts who never attempt suicide, who never die by suicide. And we need to give them space and a space to be able to talk about those things. And so, yes, I've had a number of patients actually who have shared that they had suicidal thoughts. And one patient in particular who had ADHD, his ADHD wasn't really diagnosed till we started working together. He came to see me for another issue. But the kind of resume of unemployment and divorces and substance abuse problems and things like that were just, his life was very, very tough. And he said that the only thing that would get him through the day was the idea that he could just end it all. That was the only coping mechanism he felt he had. He said that he would rehearse in his mind various methods and different ways. And he said that would just soothe him and give him comfort, that rather than thinking, oh my gosh, I have to go 40 more years of this or 50 more years, like I can't even get through the day. His executive functioning was very, very impaired at that time. He's in a much, much better place now. But he said the idea of just getting through a day was so stressful for him that the only thing that sort of calmed him down was mentally rehearsing to himself that he could just kind of end it. And that was like a very soothing thing. Now, he felt embarrassed telling me that. And I said, but I don't want you to feel ashamed of that. And at the same time, I don't want that to be the thing that soothes you and that you cope. So number one, we had to obviously start working on the executive functioning skills. And once he started having more of those skills, he didn't need that coping mechanism as much. And what are other coping mechanisms? But there are a lot of people out there who people would probably be surprised have those kinds of thoughts. I mean, I think of the experience with ADHD as well that often doesn't get talked a lot about. And I guess this speaks to that feeling of belongingness of, how different all of us who have ADHD, how we kind of get to where we get to. And when we have this recognition that we're different in some way. And I remember at a very young age having a sense of myself, it's just different, like just and I didn't know what that meant. I just knew these people are operating in a kind of different way. And I don't know how to make sense of that. Now, thankfully, I found, birds of a feather flock together. I found friends who kind of operated in the same way or even kind of, more ADD ways. And that was very validating for me. But I definitely, and I thought, well, what if I didn't have those friends? How easy then would it be to feel very isolated with that? And then to think, well, maybe I don't fit in anywhere. When I was an adolescent, I had fears of growing up and thinking, where am I going to fit in the world? Like, this is like, I can't do this as a job. I just can't. Like, I'd be so miserable that I wouldn't even feel like that this would be a quality of life. Like, what is, I knew music was, as you said at the top of the program, I love music. I can eat, breathe music. I'll be a starving musician. That's fine. So at least that was my backup plan until I took a psychology class my senior year of high school, and that changed the trajectory of my life. But I get how I just think it's inherent for a lot of people, honestly, with ADHD, to sort of think like, how am I going to fit in? Because when you're someone who can't just easily fit into anywhere, like I have lots of friends who don't have ADHD who hate their jobs. They don't like what they do, but they can do it. And they do well at their jobs. And they just say to me, yeah, I don't like my job, but put in the time. I come home, I chill, I do what I want. I would be miserable. Like it would clinically depress me. There's no way I could go to work. Like, I have a passion for what I do because I have to, Eric, as I'm sure you can relate. Like it would really be a significant impact on my mental health if I didn't love, what I was doing. And so when you have ADHD and you feel like there's a narrow bandwidth here of where I feel like I can kind of fit in and be happy, and then you have all these other risk factors that people with ADHD may have, whether it's a comorbid disorder, whether it's family dysfunction, whether it's you can see how all those things can stack up.
This week on Hacking Your ADHD, Will Kerb talks about ADHD in the gym. Exercise is great for the ADHD brain, but what should we be doing in the gym? How do we make our exercise habits stick? Check out Will's podcast this week, ADHD in the Gym. Subscribe to these short, mindful ways to hack your ADHD. Check out Hacking Your ADHD this week and every Monday. This week, ADHD in the Gym. Join Will as he explores ways that you can work with your ADHD brain to do more of the things that you want to do. If you haven't yet checked it out, do yourself a favor. Go subscribe to Hacking Your ADHD. That's Hacking Your ADHD, available to everyone, everywhere you consume podcasts. Mark your calendars to join us next month for our next live Q&A. Join me, Brendan Mahan from ADHD Essentials, and Will Kerb from Hacking Your ADHD as we answer your questions live. We do this every second Tuesday of the month at 10:30 a.m. Pacific, 1:30 p.m. Eastern. Our next live Q&A will be Tuesday, February 11th at 12:30 p.m. Central Time. This is a great way for you to be a part of the community. To register for our free Q&A, where we'll answer your questions and try to help you with your challenges, go to ADHDrewired.com/events. That's ADHDrewired.com/events. we'll see you there. Let me circle back to when the idea of talking about suicide. And so if you are with a loved one and you ask, are you thinking about this? Or if a loved one or a friend comes in and tells you, what should a person do in response?
Yes, it's a great question. So first is to just listen, and just before saying, oh my gosh, or reacting in that way, because you have to remember suicidal thoughts are such a private experience in sort of the most internal depths of how people sort of see themselves, that they don't want to upset you by that. It's very upsetting to people who struggle with these things also. And again, when you take people with ADHD who tend to, I think because of this sort of emotional regulation, tend to be higher on the emotional sensitivity scales and empathy scales. They don't want to upset their mothers and fathers and brothers and partners by saying, sometimes I have thoughts of dying, and it gives me kind of some comfort. They feel selfish sometimes because they're like, I have a college education and I have a partner who loves me and I have wonderful children, but I still feel worthless, or I still feel like life isn't worth living. So we don't want to overreact to it. We don't want to say, how can you want to kill yourself when you have all of these things? That doesn't help someone. So we want to listen, and we want to share our concern, and we want to first, praise them for being open, because if someone is telling you that means they trust you. I tell my patients when they share that, I say, I really appreciate you opening up about that, and knowing that it must mean that you feel a sense of safety. And I want to continue giving you, that feeling in order for you to be more and more open about it. So it means that they trust you. It means that they feel some level of safety. And to say, it worries me that you have I certainly don't want you to have, those feelings. So what can I do to support you? And how can I help you get the help that you need? And, to let them know that it's more common than people think it is, that you don't think, that you say, I love you, I'm, there for you. Because I think people also feel that they're going to be judged by having, these thoughts, these feelings, like, oh, is this person crazy? Or, oh my gosh, they're so, selfish, or, how could they not see all these things? That they're thinking all of those things. They don't want to upset you. And letting them know that you can handle hearing that, and knowing that immediately give them that hotline number, 1-800-273-TALK, and to say, I want you to be talking to somebody about this. How can I help you get, the help you need? And it's whatever, and also not to simplify the reasons for suicide either. Suicide is very complex. There are a lot of different factors that go into it. If, let's say, the person has depression, it's not as simple to be like, oh, you'll take medication for your depression and the suicidality will go away. It's so individual for people. So to say there's a lot to unpack, but it is something that can be unpacked. It really is. And there are lots of people who struggle with this and get help, and they're very glad that they did get help.
So if someone were to share that they've been thinking about suicide, and you're the person listening to and receiving that disclosure, follow-up questions, have you thought about how you would do it?
Yeah. So as a clinician, we know that there are sort of these elevated risks that certainly come about when somebody has a very kind of well thought out plan. So I work with patients that will say, I just wish I could die. And that's to be taken seriously. And I'll ask them, how detailed does that get for you? And sometimes they'll say, it doesn't really go further than that. I just get so frustrated that that's what comes to mind. And that's worrisome. We don't want it to get, like the avalanche. However, if you're working with someone and they're saying, I have a firearm in my house, and I know the combination to the gun safe that my dad has, or, whatnot, and I'm just waiting for the day where all my family is not in the house so that I can do it, or something like that. That's a very, very urgent situation. And that person needs imminent help. They need, a crisis level of help. So as a clinician, one of the, statutes of confidentiality that we can break confidentiality is if we have belief that someone is at imminent risk of doing that. And I've had patients in the past where that has been the case, where I felt they could leave my office and within 24 hours that something bad's going to happen. And I've had to take actions to keep them safe. If you're, someone, it's a lot to hold, to let, whether it's family know, or if the person already has a therapist, letting their therapist know. Sometimes patients have a hard time telling their therapist, and they might be more comfortable with someone else saying it for them, as long as, they let them know about it. But when the more detailed, it means it's been thought out about, but a lot of times it's also understanding what kind of means somebody's looking for, because it's also a myth, this idea, well, if somebody wants to kill themselves, they're going to find some way of doing it. And so the argument against gun control laws or putting barriers on bridges and things like that is like, that's not going to do anything because someone could just find something else. Actually, that's not true. The studies show that most people, when they attempt, do not tend to attempt across means that, and even if somebody is suicidal and they go to a bridge to jump off that bridge and there's a barrier there and it prevents them from doing that, that may be the moment enough that gives them sort of some pause to just wait 24 hours. And in that 24 hours, they could talk to somebody and they can get help. They don't just go from that bridge to necessarily another bridge. It just doesn't always work that way. So we know, and especially, part of it, as I mentioned, guns, is this is not a political issue. This is just pure science. 50% of suicides are by firearms, and 2/3 or 66% of gun deaths are suicide deaths. So 2/3 of people who die by gun violence is not homicide, which is bad enough, is not in the form of law enforcement, is suicide. And we need to pay attention to that. The facts are that states with least gun control laws have 4 times the risk of suicide than ones without. Now, I'm not necessarily saying, okay, there's this incredible causal relationship. We know this is correlational data, but it's important to sort of look at and think about, when we know, obviously, with gun deaths, that there's over a 95% lethality rate. If people shoot themselves, it's almost 100% chance they will die. Whereas with other methods, even if somebody attempts, there can be a rate of survival with things like overdoses and things like that. So by restricting access to something like guns, you're not healing their depression. They're still going to deal with those kinds of things, but the argument that, well, if you restrict guns, they're going to do something else. That's not true, actually. It gives them more time and more opportunity to start thinking about that. And there are many people with lived experience who say that. It's
sort of like saying that a recovering alcoholic, they don't go to a bar because it's if it's right there, it's just not a good environment to be in. It doesn't mean that they're going to go find the next heroin dealer because they're not doing.
That's exactly right. That's a great metaphor. Absolutely. Absolutely.
What have been maybe some lessons that have been learned from people who have survived suicide?
So one of the things that I went to a conference last April, the American Association of Suicidology, which is a wonderful organization that I'm a member of. I went to a conference, and a lot of them were panels of people with lived experience. And they would say that often seconds within the attempt that they were making, they immediately regretted it. That there was this, and this is different kinds of attempts, middle of jumping, overdose, that they thought, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Like, is this really, the thing? And Many people, who attempt, if they don't get the help, they will attempt again. And the more attempts, increases your risk of eventual suicide. However, most people who attempt suicide do not die by suicide, meaning that a lot of times after an attempt, if they survive the attempt, may be more likely to seek treatment or get help for it. Obviously, depending on the nature of the means, other people are aware of this issue in most of these cases. So people are getting help. And many of these people with lived experience will say, thank goodness that didn't happen. Thank goodness I was able to see it. But part of it is dealing with mental health issues. For, the patients I work with ADHD, is recognizing that, maybe these, there's no question it could be difficult if you have major executive dysfunction, but there are ways and strategies to get through it. And you don't have to be the most organized person to be a valuable person. That this goes beyond that. This goes to your self-worth and sort of like your soul work. And, when you're somebody, you don't have to be the top of your class to be valuable or to be worthy. You don't have to be a great reader to be a good person. And that, unfortunately, for lots of people's experience with ADHD, because of either messaging that they've gotten culturally by people straight out, or that they've internalized, they feel less than and inferior. So this is beyond, I'm not good at organizing. This gets to, I'm a worthless person. And that's what we want to stop right there and then. I mean, my he has ADHD and dyslexia. He's 14 now and he's doing very well. He was diagnosed at 6. And the first thing, and he had severe dyslexia, very, very severe dyslexia. And I mean, he was basically a non-reader. And honestly, my biggest concern was not even that he was going to be able to read or be a good reader. My number one concern is he cannot think that he's stupid or that he's worthless and that there's no hope in chasing your dreams. You can't, that's the thing I will not accept, because I'm not to this day, I'm not a fast reader. I haven't read a fiction book in 30 years. But we of course gave him, we gave him the remediation and he's now at grade level and he's fine. And I'm happy about that, but he's not going to ever be somebody who's going to love probably to read. That's okay. But I cannot have him think that he's less than because of that. And that's where the conversation in the ADHD community, we have to really pay attention to is, yes, there are these challenges. Yes, it's frustrating, but we're not less than, because of that.
Yeah. And I think that really is the core of what we're doing here, to help people know that they really are not alone, which is why community is such an important part of living with ADHD. Because, when you think that you're the only one that is this way, it's just an awful isolating feeling when you realize that there are other people who, yes, have struggles, and also can be doing okay in areas too. That's just so important.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I heard consistently from people and from patients of mine who have attempted suicide or have suicidal thoughts, as well as people who have ADHD and certainly people who are in both of those worlds, is what you said, is finding your tribe, is finding your community. I mean, when the ADHD conference where we both attend and speak at every year, there is an energy there. I always describe this to people. I mean, you know exactly what I'm talking about, that for people who haven't gone, who have ADHD, and especially when they feel alone in it, I said, you walk in there and there is just an energy. It's just palpable of just,
getting goosebumps just you describing it. Yeah.
I just feel like it's like a big hug, honestly. Like I feel like the very first conference I spoke at, 2008 in Anaheim, California, I actually was registering. It was the day before the first day. And I remember there was a table with an iPod and there was a sneaker and there was some other item. And I said, this is a true story. I said, is there like a silent auction? And they were like, no, that's like our lost and found. Like somebody lost. And I went, I am home with my people. Like people get off at the wrong floor in the elevator, but there's no judgment. Like we all get it.
Yes.
And as at that point, my son was only 3. And so I was going as a professional, as a parent, and I attended a talk, and it was just a panel of parents, and they were talking about raising their ADHD kids. And it was so helpful. My son was only 3, but it was evident from prenatally that he had ADHD. And to feel that just the sense of, oh my gosh, this person is speaking my language. And when you struggle with depression, when you struggle with suicidality, finding the right support, finding people who can talk that language and understand it and can absorb it is just super important, because the very thing that brings people to those places of darkness is feeling so disconnected from being a human being. I mean, from all the things that make us feel human.
Well, this is certainly not one of our lighter topics that we've had on this show, but certainly a highly important discussion. And I think that, for me, one of the big takeaways is just the importance of talking about it to destigmatize it.
Yes.
And not being afraid to ask about it if you have that concern. So those are some really big takeaways. There's one other thing that you mentioned during your talk, and then we'll end this conversation. But the idea of the non-suicide contracts. How it's basically like they're just kind of a waste of time.
So in the mental health world, they would have, it's when you think about it, it's so absurd, this idea that if somebody's has serious suicidal ideation, you have them sign a contract that says, I will not engage in suicidal behavior. I will not do this. I will not do this. And studies show it's not helpful or effective at all. As well as from a professional standpoint, is almost this liability, because it's like, okay, well, you knew that somebody was at risk enough to have them sign, this contract. But what we do want to do is help patients in terms of what to do as opposed to what not to do. Yes. So when you're feeling this, these are the things that we want you to do. This is my number, 911, these coping mechanisms, these coping skills. And also just a couple notes. One on the ADHD piece is for people to know that studies show that if you treat the ADHD, that it is associated with a significant risk reduction for suicide attempts and suicidality when ADHD is in the mix, even in the presence of other mental health issues. So it is very, very important that we understand that. And then just as another note is when you talk about the destigmatization, that the reason that in the community, we're moving away from saying committed suicide, because as opposed to this person died by suicide, is the word committed has this connotation of a sin. And sometimes people who express these concerns, and certainly in the past, have been told by their clergy or pastor that they're committing a sin because this is an act of murder. I remember in high school, somebody had died by suicide. He came from an Irish Catholic family, and the church would not do a funeral because he died by suicide. And that was a totally acceptable thing in at least Catholic churches. And there's a family now in the US that people can Google who this couple tragically lost their son to suicide. And during the funeral, they specifically instructed the priest not to, we want to focus on his life and not to talk. And this priest went on to talk, not only mentioned suicide a number of times, but also said how basically this person is now, in this kind of eternal damnation. All of these, horrendous. And they have a suit against them, and they should, because that's just horrible. That even we're in 2020,
that's horrifying.
That there is that little of an understanding that we still have the stigmatization that this is a sin, as opposed to, I think, for people to understand the pain that somebody has to be in to end their life, something that biologically we're almost programmed not to do.
You're overriding your biology.
that you have to be in so much pain and agony. And so to have that connotation of like it's a sin, that is what keeps a lot of people from ever speaking out, is because they fear they're going to actually not only not be maybe taken seriously, but actually be told that they're bad people because they have these kinds of thoughts. So that's what we want to destigmatize. And that's why I'm glad we're talking about it, because I know, you have a great membership of people that listen to your podcast, and for people out there to know that there's help, and having ADHD to validate that experience for a lot of us with ADHD, that it can be hard enough that sometimes we think of those. We can get to dark places pretty quickly with ADHD, but when treated and managed, we can get to incredibly bright rainbow places with ADHD.
Roberto, give us one more time that suicide hotline.
Sure. It's 1-800-273-8255 or 1-800-273-TALK.
Dr. Roberto Olivardia, thank you so much for coming back on, and you are welcome back anytime.
Absolutely. I'll be back at some point. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks so much. This is Eric Tivers. Thank you for listening, and congratulations for making it to the end. ADHD Rewired is more than just a podcast. We are a community focused on learning, growing, and connection. The website is adhdrewired.com. You can find summaries and additional resources for each episode. You can apply to our free and secret Facebook community. You can learn more about ADHD Rewired's intensive online video-based coaching and accountability groups, and sign up for my email newsletter to get exclusive content you won't get anywhere else. It's all at adhdrewired.com. While you're there, click the Patreon button. If you're a regular listener and you're still listening to my voice, consider making a monthly contribution by becoming a patron through our Patreon page. If you are able to financially support my work, it would mean a lot. This show is free to listeners, but it is not free to produce. And patrons get really cool perks. You can follow me on Twitter at Eric Tivers. You can like our Facebook page at facebook.com/ADHD Rewired. If you're a coach, therapist, or related professional, connect with me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/Eric Tivers. You can also subscribe to ADHD Rewired on YouTube. And you can subscribe to ADHD Rewired on YouTube and see select interviews and some other videos I've posted. Podcasts change lives. You can make a difference in someone's life by spreading the word about this podcast. Mention it in your online communities on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, or wherever you hang out online. And be sure to share it with your friends and your family and your clients, as well as your coaches, therapists, and doctors. And if you're a coach, therapist, doctor, or ADHD support group leader, and you would like a pack of podcast postcards to hand out, you can request those at my website, adhdrewired.com. And if you're a member of CHAD or any other ADHD support group, please be sure to tell them about this podcast. You can even show them how to download it on their phone. You know, you might be the person that turns somebody on to a podcast for the very first time. And if you really love this episode, please consider hitting share on your podcast player. I'm only one person, and I count on you to help me spread the message. One of the biggest things that you can do to support this podcast and to help other people discover it is to leave an honest rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or any other podcast app that accepts ratings and reviews. And don't forget to hit subscribe on this podcast on your podcast app so new episodes are automatically pushed to your favorite podcast app. Looking for more ways to listen and learn? Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/ADHD Rewired. Not sure where to start? In no particular order. Check out Atomic Habits by James Clear, The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk, 10% Happier, and Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics. These are both by Dan Harris. Change Your Questions and Change Your Life by Marilee G. Adams. The One Thing by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. Procrastinate on Purpose by Rory Vaden. The 4 Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin. Do you have trouble asking for help? Listen to The Art of Asking by Amanda Palmer. It's one of the best produced audiobooks I've ever heard. If you're looking for something a little bit more, say, magical, I unexpectedly fell in love with the Harry Potter series. And I don't usually listen to those kinds of books, and I loved it. And of course, if you haven't yet boarded the Brene Brown bus yet, check out Brene Brown's books, starting with The Gifts of Imperfection, Daring Greatly, Rising Strong, The Power of Vulnerability, And if you're an entrepreneur or leader in any capacity, check out her 2018 book, Dare to Lead. And Brene still is my most wanted guest, so if you know Brene, and you would be so kind to make that connection for me, I would be really, really grateful. You know who else I would like to have on the show? You. Click the podcast tab at ADHDrewired.com and then click the Be a Guest button at the top of that page and schedule a 15-minute pre-interview. This is Eric Tibbers, reminding you to keep learning, keep growing, and keep connecting. Self-care is not selfish, and no matter what gets done or doesn't get done, at the end of the day, you are still enough. And no matter how hard it feels, we can do hard things. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next week.